All right, how is everybody doing? Having fun, right? It's an awesome meeting so far. This next session is super exciting. We're going to start it with one of our tribute videos. This is a video in tribute to Dr. Robert Izant, and it's just Casey's great planning or a coincidence or something, but I was a medical student at Case Western, and Dr. Izant was my inspiration for pediatric surgery. And Corey Chris, who put together this tribute, is training at Case Western currently and will be a ped surgery fellow at University of Michigan. So we come full circle. Anyway, so we'll play the video now, please.
Dr. Robert J. Izant was born in 1921 in Cleveland, Ohio. After attending Amherst College in Massachusetts, he studied medicine at Western Reserve School of Medicine in Cleveland, Ohio, graduating in 1947. He went on to train in general surgery at Western Reserve, where he was known for his tireless dedication to his patients and technical talents in the operating room. During this time, he developed a love for children and decided to pursue his pediatric surgery training at Boston Children's Hospital under Dr. Robert E. Gross. Dr. Gross became a lifelong friend and mentor to Dr. Izant throughout his life. Dr. Izant returned to Ohio, first to Columbus and then back to Cleveland. He returned as a full-time faculty member at Case Western, where he quickly became recognized as a teacher and mentor for students, both undergraduate and medical. He went on to spend 15 years as a director of surgical education program. He was beloved by the general surgery residents and was fondly remembered as a pediatric surgeon with strict attention to detail and a great communicator to families. He was a prominent academic contributor both locally and nationally. Most notably, he was one of the founding members of APSA and the first governor. During its conception, it was Dr. Izant who was delegated as one of the initial drafters of the Constitution and bylaws of the society. Not surprisingly, he absolutely loved going to the meetings every year and looked forward to them months in advance. One of his close friends knew when APSA was coming up because he was always in a better mood. Throughout his career, Dr. Izant was known for his warmth, generosity, wit, and true dedication to children. He had a career that flourished and truly had an impact on generations of children. Despite all of his remarkable professional accomplishments and responsibilities, he was also an avid watercolor painter and expert fly fisherman. He took inspiration for his paintings from his travels and his roots in northeastern Ohio. His work has been featured in multiple shows and venues, including the halls of Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. Dr. Robert J. Izant was a caring and generous person with a larger-than-life personality, who was even nicknamed the Big Guy by everyone who knew him. He embodied the mission of APSA, one that is dedicated not only to saving lives, but saving lifetimes.
Wonderful tribute by Corey. Thanks so much. So this is our first PED Talk of the meeting. I think that many of you know that, we're shifting things up a little bit here. Dr. Herschel has turned us a little bit upside down, but it's really because we live in a world that is changing so rapidly. And if I could, as I introduce Michael, if you could just put up the first slide. So many of you know what Moore's Law is, and this is sort of an extension of Moore's Law. If you look over the last 100 years in what's happened in computing power, and Moore's Law, who was the CEO of Intel, but basically said that the number of transistors we could fit on an integrated circuit would double every 16 months to 24 months. And we've all lived that, those of us who have lived through the computer age and seen the rapid progression in our computing power. Now we're in an era where we're entering not just exponential change, but that exponential change is changing exponentially. And this is a really unique time period. Today, we are really pleased to have Michael Muelly with us. Michael is going to share with you his experience now working with Google, but as he's evolved through first starting out at Stanford in radiology and starting to work with machine learning, and you'll start to understand the importance of some of these things and the impact they are going to have on our lives, both as practitioners and our lives throughout. So it's really my pleasure to welcome Michael to the stage now and talk to us about artificial intelligence.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. Very excited to be here. I started out originally in network security, doing network security for a couple of banks in Switzerland. Really kind of got bored of that, and then thought that medicine is a field where we have a lot of data that we're not really making use of. That was really the reason I went to medical school. And at some point, my journey took me through pediatric surgery, actually. I did a surgical internship at Penn State and had the pleasure of doing a couple months there. There we go. Despite the new format, financial disclosures, I'm an employee of Google, so my presentation here is heavily biased. Healthcare of the future, build of today's tool, right? So artificial intelligence has been around a long time, but over the past 6-7 years or so, it has become a big hot topic, especially in radiology, where there's a lot of talk about replacing radiologists, and that's not why I'm at Google. I just think that there's tremendous opportunity. But there are a lot of things that we can actually do today. I'm going to take you through a little story here with Robert. Robert is a type 1 diabetic, since childhood. He is poorly controlled. He's not taking care of himself anymore. One day he collapses at home. He hits his head. He fortunately has wearable sensors, so the sensor is able to detect that he fell, and also that his blood glucose is significantly elevated. Now his family doctor, she gets an alert. She is able to organize an admission for Robert and really send him to the most appropriate hospital. So the decision of which hospital to send him to, based on the artificial intelligence tools that are built into the system, allowed him to pick the optimal hospital for his condition, which in this case is trauma. Now, Dr. Johnson, one of the trauma surgeons, she receives a notification as soon as Robert arrives at the hospital, and his case is prioritized using artificial intelligence according to his condition, the severity, and he's bumped up over other patients that may be arriving at the same time. Now, to the radiology part, he's getting a CT like every trauma patient does. But as part of that, right, using what the models already know about him, they bump up his case. So his case is prioritized because there likely is something serious going on. Now, the imaging algorithms, they identify a brain bleed. For this size bleed, obviously, you don't need a radiologist, you don't need AI. But smaller ones, right, can be also detected using artificial intelligence, ones that are actually, even for radiologists, hard to see, that frequently get missed. In the operating room, the surgical team uses AI to navigate, right, to actually remove the hematoma as effectively and reducing the risk of the surgery as much as possible. Now Robert begins his recovery. There's a sepsis alert. An artificial intelligence model detects that there is likely sepsis onset. He develops a high temperature, and we get an X-ray. So this machine learning model identifies that he has a right lower lobe pneumonia, right? And you see the red outline, right? The exciting thing about this model is it can actually tell you where it thinks this pneumonia is. He gets treated for the pneumonia, he makes a good recovery, and his discharge reports, papers, medical coding are all automatically completed, making the life for the physician, for the surgeon, a lot easier. And then, finally, his autonomous vehicle takes him home. So, healthcare of the future, powered by artificial intelligence. All the things I showed here are actually things that have been developed, that exist, that just are not deployed in hospitals today, but they could be. But when we say artificial intelligence, let's get back to the basics, right? What does that mean? Artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, those terms are thrown around a lot. Artificial intelligence, right, it's really the most generic term. It doesn't even have to be computers, right? It's any artificial system that can perform tasks which are typically associated with humans. Visual perception being a big one, speech recognition, complex decision making, right, and translation. Machine learning, that's now talking about computers specifically, right? Using computer systems to learn from data that tells the computer things that have not been explicitly programmed, right? So it learns the rules from the data as opposed to having to explicitly tell the computer. And finally, and this is really the reason why artificial intelligence has become so popular again, deep learning, right? This is a subfield of machine learning where we have algorithms that are inspired by neurons, and these are very, very large. Hence deep learning, because there are so many that are connected with each other. So inspired by the behavior of biological neurons, right? These have actually been around for a long time. Late 40s, 50s is kind of when the first mathematical frameworks were developed. And when I was an undergrad studying computer science, I actually played around with neural networks back then too. The problem was very compute constrained. They were very small. They couldn't do much. Now in 2016, the neural networks of today, they are much, much larger, right? They have different specializations in different areas and are able to do a lot more. So what do they do, right? How do they do it? You show the neural network model some examples of whatever you wanted to learn, a lot of examples. Those examples have a label attached, right? So the cat is a cat, dog is a dog. You show this network many, many examples. We're talking on the order of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. And it's able to learn the classification. It's learning the features in the image that make this a cat or that make this a dog. And then, once you want the classification, right, you have a trained model. You give it a picture, and the question is this a cat or is this a dog? The categories that you trained it for, it's able to make this classification even when the dog is all curled up like this. So what's different today? We were talking about Moore's law earlier, right? It's really compute, right? Before 2010 or so, these approaches were very, very limited. As compute became more available, right, and much cheaper, and some other things were tried in terms of compute. Instead of the typical CPU, GPUs, graphical processing units, are used for these. The capabilities of the neural networks much outpaced all the traditional machine learning algorithms, right? And the second part of that is that you need a lot of data. So in 2009, Fei Li from Stanford, she collected a very large data set, 15 million images, called ImageNet. And that combination of the computational power and the availability of images is really what significantly improved the performance of neural networks, which now very much dominate all artificial intelligence applications today. Now, what's different about them, right? So traditional computer vision or traditional machine learning methods, you actually need to tell them what to learn, right? So you tell them specifically, I want to look for this feature, and they learn this feature. Machine learning, deep learning methods are very exciting in that regard, that they automatically learn the features, right? So whether or not you know what is the association, the deep learning model actually learns it based on all the examples you show it. Now, it may have to be a lot of examples, right? Hundreds of thousands, millions, but if there's any association at all with enough reinforcement, the neural network is going to learn it. Now, what about medicine? So one of the first areas that deep learning was applied really were medical images, right? It's an obvious application. It's very interesting at Google. Google engineers work on very large-scale things, but everybody's very excited about healthcare, right? Making an impact beyond search, making an impact beyond ads. So we get a lot of very excited engineers. And how this work started at Google was actually an engineer who went to India, and he saw a line in front of a ophthalmology clinic, and they were doing eye screenings. The problem was that clinic only operated a couple times a year, and other than that, there was nobody around, right? There's a shortage of about 75,000 ophthalmologists in India. So he took the images that he was able to get, ran them through the same algorithm that powers Google Photos, got very good results in classifying diabetic retinopathy, and now that it's actually being deployed in some of those clinics in India. So what can AI actually do for providers, physicians? It's really assist, right? So first of all, it can help us a lot by automating boring tasks, by increasing quality, by increasing consistency in clinical care. I like to harp on the fact that really, despite talking about evidence-based medicine, most of what we do in medicine is not very data-driven, right? It's basically what I was taught. It's basically what my teacher was taught, very empirically. And the example that you see here is a model that we developed at DeepMind, which is a Google company. And they are doing head and neck segmentation for radiation therapy, right? Typically, that's a task that takes a radiology tech about 5 hours. This model is able to do it pretty much instantly and reduce that variability that you typically get from humans doing anything. Augmentation. This is an example of a pathology model that automatically highlights areas that are cancer. So we built this model into a microscope, and with this augmented reality microscope now, your attention gets drawn to the areas of interest that a pathologist might otherwise miss. So augmentation of what we do, I think, is a big, big promise of artificial intelligence. And then the most exciting thing, I think, is extending our knowledge, right? So those retinal images I was talking about, if you give them different labels, right? Let's say not the diabetic retinopathy classification, but age, smoking status, blood pressure, you can actually predict that just from the retinal image, right? Which no ophthalmologist has been able to explain how the models actually do that. And then even more exciting, right? I mean, sex is very easy to determine without a machine learning model. But more exciting then is some things like cardiovascular risk. Being able to predict the likelihood of a cardiovascular incident using these models actually works much, much better than our standard approaches. And that's just from the retinal images. Now imagine if you take more data points and use all of those to make predictions, right? So pathology, genotype, EHR, imaging phenotype, whatever data points we may have, and train those models for the outcomes, right? There's a lot of interesting insights and data that we are just not aware today that can be gleaned using these models. Now, what about surgery? It's a surgical conference, so we definitely need to talk about surgery. Surgery, I think, is a little bit more challenging for these models, right? Just by the nature of it. Most of surgery is not digital, right? Radiology, we now pretty much everywhere have digital images. No such thing naturally occurs in surgery, right? Except for laparoscopic videos. So using enough laparoscopic videos, right? We actually built a video pipeline at one of our sister companies, Verily, where we derive surgical insights from that video, right? First of all, very basic, is this even a surgical video, right? Imagine if you're on YouTube, looking at videos, we actually want to know that, right? And then there's a lot of other things you can tell, like how many people operate, right? Has the video been edited? How much bleeding occurs? Are the surgical planes properly dissected, right? Which surgical procedure is it? What tasks are performed? What events are happening? What is the skill level, ultimately, right? And all of these things can be predicted from laparoscopic surgery videos. right? The challenge with laparoscopic surgery videos is most people don't record them, right? So getting your hands on a large data set like this is actually very, very difficult. So this is an example of a machine learning model that was trained. This is actually by a laboratory at the University of Strasbourg, where they identified the instrument and trajectory of the instrument using this deep learning approach. And you can very easily see that this is really the first step to be able to do more of this in an automated manner. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that surgery will be replaced, right? But I think there's very, very specific tasks where the fine control of a robot combined with an artificial intelligence tool may be very useful. So healthcare of the future built of today's tools, right? Deep learning really already outperforms humans in very specific tasks. But not all tasks are amenable, right? The models are very specific. They are very much trained for a very specific task, and they don't generalize. And the big issue, and I think that especially applies to surgery, and especially pediatric surgery, right, is access to high-quality data sets. You need a lot of data to train these, and without the data for training, there are really no machine learning models that are useful. Thank you very much.
Michael, that was awesome. We'll have time maybe for a couple questions. So one question would be, given what you just said at the end there about pediatric surgery, where we're still a relatively rare specialty, we don't have huge data sets. What could we do as a society to get around that, or what can we do to sort of help create data sets that might be useful, either both just in the US, but more globally for pediatric surgeons to be able to put that data together that then we can use these types of tools on?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that is very much up to the medical societies, right? First of all, it needs to start at the local level, right? I mean, if there's any interest, you want to start collecting the data points that may be useful. In radiology, we have done this naturally, right? Just because we need the priors for comparison. But in other areas, now that we see that there may be a lot of value in that data, I think starting to collect the data points, even without any specific goal in mind right now, is really the first step. But then the problem is always barriers, right, across institutions. And I think that's where the Pediatric Surgical Society would come in, right? It's really creating this overarching framework for how does the data get shared, right? How do we maintain patient rights, consent, things like that, but still make the data useful and available for research purposes.
Sure. So, for example, we generate lots of videos. Locally, many of us struggle with where to store them, and then eventually how to put those all in a common library, which would be really useful. So that's potentially an area for us to work on as a society. So also with artificial intelligence, of course, there's the side of, with this rapid change, then the change, as we talked about, is exponentially increasing in its rate of change. How do we manage this from the sort of the ethical challenges and some of the things we're all worried about? I saw one of these, there's these stories now, if you're a Tesla driver, but people trying to brake in front of a Tesla or doing crazy things. This is a resistance to, automation or artificial applications of artificial intelligence. But where do you see the challenges or the resistance coming from, either providers or patients in our healthcare system? And how do we deal with kind of keeping our growth or our knowledge of how to deal with these things also growing at a rapid rate?
So, I think one big issue with these models, because they are, you essentially train and brute force with your data, is that they just do what is in the data, right? So if your data is not broad and generalizable, they will have a bias built in. Be it a racial bias, ethnic bias, local bias, right? Prevalence of diseases varies a lot. And so we need those very heterogeneous data sets that have data points for all these different things in order to be able to train generalizable models. In terms of resistance, right, I think once you prove the value, I think the resistance will go away. It's to be proven. I think a self-driving car is actually a great example of what I see as the canary in the coal mine for artificial intelligence applications. And the value, you can't argue with that.
Yeah. No, that's great. And in surgery, or I guess if you maybe mentioned it, is the fact that imaging and radiology, how do you see if in looking at your specialty, so where you've had now fair number of companies that are moving these technologies forward, looking to make a business model out of it where they make money, how do you see in just your specific specialty the impact on the providers that are currently that, and what maybe the future of the specialty might be, since that one's a little bit further along?
Yeah, in my clinical practice, I do not use any artificial intelligence tools today, right? Well, besides voice dictation, that has taken a strong foothold in radiology. But it is about the value ultimately, right? And that business model that really is driven by the value. And I think right now, it's still an open question where the value lies. Being in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, people get excited very easily, right? And it's actually very easy to come by money to start a company to do these kinds of things. But the value is still to be proven as to where exactly it makes sense. But I think once that fit with the market is found, right, there will be a lot of applications that we will be taking advantage of in radiology.
Yeah. And then maybe a final question. And I love how hopefully everybody's getting a little better idea of what machine learning is, deep learning, and artificial intelligence, because those terms are important to understand the distinctions. One of the things that maybe some of us don't think about every day, and I know big companies are thinking about, is there's data generated all around us, all the time. So, if you look at in a neonatal unit, we have an isolate, and there's an EKG monitor, there's a pulse ox monitor, there's potentially visual things captured, there's a temperature of the baby, there's maybe a respiratory monitor, whatever. All that data that then, if you put that in the context of what's happening clinically to that patient and pulling things from if it ever becomes useful, our electronic health record. But where do you see that sort of data we don't think about? That's actually because everything has, every electronic device has the ability for us to capture that data. But where do you see maybe in medicine those sort of applications of artificial intelligence and how they might impact and help us to learn about diseases or picking up, earlier times to intervene, for example, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was getting out of extending our knowledge with different data sources, right? So not just limited to the EHR data, pathology, genomics that I showed there, but really, using device data, for example. The vendors more and more, right, they're thinking about this, and the data is starting to be centralized and collected, right? And I think that's the first step in order to actually prove that there's any value to doing that.
And maybe one last one. If our audience here, if they, at their institution, they want to dig into these things, they want to try to understand how they might apply them, what would you suggest for them if, where they might go to sort of broaden their knowledge or to find, collaborators or that at their institutions? Yeah, I mean, in general, right, computer scientists are very excited to work on useful applications. So, whatever institution nearby has a computer science department, they, reach out to those computer scientists there, and I'm sure they're very happy to actually get their hands on clinical data and work on something that is useful and meaningful. Great. Well, thank you very much for sharing this exciting thing, and we'll look forward to the additional PED Talks. I think we're a little ahead of schedule, so we'll move on with the program. Thank you.